In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He spoke it all into existence, and he did it in 6 days. And on the sixth day, he created man and woman, Adam and Eve, and he placed them in the Garden of Eden. He told them to be fruitful and multiply. He told them to subdue the earth and to fill it. He told them, well, in that moment, everything was good. But it didn't last very long, because shortly after that, in comes Satan in the form of a snake, slithers onto the scene, and instills doubt in Eve's mind. He tells her a lie. He tells her that if she was to eat of the forbidden fruit, that she could be as wise as God, and she would know what God is keeping from her. And so in that moment of weakness, Eve eats the fruit, and sin enters the world. In that moment, death enters the world as well. And as a matter of fact, death should have been the consequence that was given to Adam and Eve for their sin. However, in his grace, in God's grace, instead he only cursed mankind rather than killing them in this moment. So this curse that was placed on them, they knew, God began to explain to them that this curse would last a really long time, but it would not last forever. So in that moment, God did have a plan. He knew that he was going to redeem his people, and the plan starts right here in Genesis 3. And in Genesis 3:15, the scriptures say that the seed of the woman will one day crush the head of the serpent. And so that in Genesis 3, that's the very first foreshadowing, the very first pointing to Jesus Christ in Genesis 3:15. So after this, God does, as a consequence of their sin, Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden, and but they do begin to be fruitful and multiply, like he told them to. So as mankind multiplies, unfortunately, so does their sin. And so it gets to a point where mankind is evil and wicked, and all they think about is sinful things. And God at this point decides that he wants a do-over. He wants to start over. So he decides he's going to flood the earth to destroy all of mankind and start over. But before he does so, he enlists one faithful man, Noah, and he asks Noah to build him an ark. And he tells Noah, I'm going to send these floodwaters, but I'm going to allow your family, and I'd like you to put 2 of all the creatures of the earth onto your ark. So Noah builds the ark faithfully. The floodwaters come, and eventually, after the floodwaters subside, we have Noah's family that is essentially starting over. So now they again begin to be fruitful and multiply. But if you remember, God told them to fill the earth, to subdue the whole earth. And what mankind was doing at this moment was multiplying, but they were being very prideful, and they were all sticking together. As a matter of fact, they thought that they could be, that they had it all together, and that they could actually build a tower up to heaven to meet God. They thought that they could work together, and so that's the story of the Tower of Babel. And at this point, God again looks down on mankind, and he says, they're not obeying, they're prideful, they think that they can reach me, when in reality, it's me that eventually comes down to them, again, in the form of Christ, eventually. So in this moment, God decides, in his anger, to scatter the people and to confuse their languages. So now we have the people scattered in confused languages, and we see the story kind of shift from God working on mankind as a whole, to now God is going to begin this redemption story. He's going to try and redeem his people through one particular family, and that's when we're introduced to Abraham. So God says to Abraham, hey, I want you to leave where you're at right now, take your family with you and go. I'm going to take you, I'll show you where you're going, but I want you to go. And in faith, Abraham trusts God, and he begins to move towards where God is asking him to go. And in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, I believe, as Abraham is starting to move, God makes this promise to Abraham. It's called the Abrahamic covenant, and this really becomes the underlying theme for the remainder of the Old Testament story. This idea of land, seed, and blessing is the promise that is made to Abraham. He tells Abraham, hey, I'm going to take your family, I'm going to give you this land, and it will be a beautiful, a great land, but this is where I'm taking you. I'll give your family the land. I'm going to give you descendants, the seed, descendants. I'm going to give you not just one descendant, but many descendants, as many as stars in the sky. And he also tells him that I'm going to bless you. I'm going to bless all of the world, all of the nations through your family. I'm going to bless those who bless you, and I'm going to curse those who curse you. So Abraham is like, okay, Lord, I'll trust you. And so in Genesis 15:6, I believe, is when Abraham outwardly says that he's trusting in God, and God says that he credits this to Abraham as righteousness, just because he has faith. And again, this all the way foreshadows to us when we are saved, when we, in that moment of salvation for us, we are credited as righteous just by having faith in Jesus Christ. There's nothing else that we can do. Just by faith, we are considered righteous enough to be with God. So here we have Abraham, and he's just received this promise, and it seems far-fetched. And he has a wife, Sarah, who is 90 years old. He's near 100 years old. And finally, God does deliver on this promise, and they have a son named Isaac. So we know the famous Abraham-Isaac story where God tests Abraham's faith again and asks him to sacrifice his own son, Isaac. He walks him up the mountain. He has him there, and he's ready to sacrifice his own son because God said to. He trusted God so much that even though he knew that the promise was through his descendants, he was willing to sacrifice his own descendant, and only descendant at that time, because he believed in God. And at just the last moment, God provided him a ram, provided for that sacrifice, just like God eventually provides Jesus for us as that sacrifice that we need in our lives to be right with God. So Isaac goes on, and he eventually has two sons, Esau and Jacob. Jacob is the younger son, and he's a deceiver from the very beginning. And he weasels his way into the family blessing from Isaac. And Jacob eventually has 12 sons. These 12 sons go on to represent the 12 tribes of Judah.
Of Israel.
I'm sorry, thank you. The 12 tribes of Israel. The fourth son is Judah, and this is through whom the line to Jesus runs. Okay, the line to Jesus runs eventually through Judah. However, the narrative story of the Old Testament focuses on his favorite son named Joseph. So Joseph is amongst his 12 brothers, but Joseph is clearly the favorite, and this puts him in a bad spot, right? He's got 11 brothers who are envious of him and the fact that he's the favorite. So they decided they're going to kidnap their brother. They consider killing him. They eventually sell him into slavery. And Joseph ends up a slave, imprisoned in Egypt. And through a miraculous series of events, Joseph goes from prison in Egypt to being second in charge of all of Egypt. He becomes the right-hand man of Pharaoh in Egypt, and he makes great, wise decisions, and he helps them prepare for this famine that he knows is coming. And so he's in a position to help the entire nation of Egypt survive a famine. And here's the cool part of the story. Joseph's brothers, the entire family of Jacob, is in this position where they have to come to Egypt to find food to survive the famine. And they have this encounter back with their brother. And Joseph has this opportunity to save his family, provide them with the food. And he has this moment with his family where he's reunited with his brothers, and they're terrified, and they think that he's going to be mean to them, want to destroy them. But he forgives them, and it's this great moment. And I think the scripture is Genesis 50:20 talks about this idea that what the enemy meant for evil, God used for good. And it's just this amazing story of how Joseph was reunited with his family and was able to provide for them in a moment. So that's how so Jacob also had a moment where he wrestled with God, and his name was changed to Israel, and all of his sons, the whole nation, all the 12 tribes became the nation of Israel a little bit further back in the story. But now that is how the entire nation of Israel made it into Egypt, was that story of how Jacob was able to help his family. Pharaoh said, hey, thank you so much for what you did. I want your whole family to come and live in Egypt now. So now we have this nation of Israel living in Egypt. 400 years go by, and this nation continues to grow. Probably it reaches 2 or 3 million Israelites living in Egypt. And the new Pharaoh doesn't really care about or know Joseph. Joseph and Jacob, and they had all died. But now the new Pharaoh sees Israel as a threat. So he enslaves all of Israel, and he even wants all Israelite boys killed. And this is where we're introduced to the story of Moses, where one Israelite mom puts her baby in the basket in the Nile River, and the baby floats down the river and is essentially plucked from the river and ends up being raised in Pharaoh's household, in his own household. And so that's Moses, who we're introduced to at this point in the story. So Moses, he is this Israelite living in Egypt and seeing his fellow Israelites enslaved. He loses his temper, and he actually murders an Egyptian. He ends up having to flee out into the wilderness, and this is the part of the story where we have the moment where Moses encounters the burning bush. And Moses has this encounter with God speaking to him through this burning bush. And in this moment, God says to Moses, you're the man. You're the man for the job. You're the man that's going to go to Pharaoh and explain to him that I want him to free my people. You're going to be the one that's going to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. So Moses is like, really? Me? Like, you're calling me to do this? Moses tried to argue his way out of it, tried to tell him he wasn't good enough, that he couldn't be the one for the job, but he is. And so Moses goes back to Pharaoh on 9 different occasions. This is where we have the 10 plagues, okay? So the first 9 times he goes back after each plague, and he tries to tell Pharaoh, let God's people go. And Pharaoh keeps saying, no. Pharaoh has a hard heart. I don't know who your God is, Pharaoh says. I'm not going to let your people go. So finally, God decides he has to send this 10th plague. And the 10th plague that God sends is where we come up with this idea of the annual Israelite ritual, Passover. Because God lets his Israelite people know through Moses that they are to sacrifice a spotless lamb and take the blood from the lamb and paint it over their doorposts of their homes, so that night when the angel of the Lord comes to kill all of the Egyptian firstborns, that the angel of the Lord will pass over the homes that are marked with the blood, knowing that they're God's people. And so that happens overnight. The next morning, Pharaoh wakes up and realizes that his firstborn son was killed. And in this moment, Pharaoh finally says, I've had enough of this God. Fine, take your people and go. And he lets the Israelites free. He lets them leave Egypt. So the Israelites start to move out of Egypt, and now they're moving towards this promised land. Remember the land that was promised to Abraham. And Moses is going to be the one to lead them there. So then here's the point in the story, the famous point. Pharaoh changes his mind. He's like, why am I letting them go? That was a mistake. I need to go after them. So he sends his army after them. And this is where the Israelites get backed up against the Red Sea. And where with Moses, he takes his staff and he punches it into the sea, and God splits the Red Sea so that the nation of Israel can walk across on dry land. And then when Pharaoh's army comes in to chase after them, and they're in the sea, God releases the water and he destroys Pharaoh's army. And the Israelites are free and on the other side of the Red Sea. So now they've been redeemed from slavery in Egypt, and now they're going to move towards Mount Sinai as a group, and Moses will lead them there. So eventually they make it to Mount Sinai, and this is where God says to Moses, and Moses eventually says to the people, hey, God wants to enter into a covenant with us. He wants us to be his people. He wants us to, I think it's in Exodus 19:6, where God basically says to his people, I want you to be a kingdom of priests. if you obey my commands and you stick to this covenant, I will, you will be blessed. I will give you all that you need, and through you, the nations will be blessed. But he wants to enter into this covenant with his people. And his people say yes. And they're like, okay, this sounds great. Let's do it. So Moses is called up the mountain. He's given the 10 commandments at this point, right? And he comes back down, and they start to understand the law and start to try and abide by the law. Moses is called back up to the mountain again to meet with God, because God wants to give him the instructions to the tabernacle. God says, okay, if you're going to be my people, you're going to live by this covenant, I want to dwell right here with you. And so God gives them the instructions to build the tabernacle, very detailed instructions. And so they come down and they build this tent, this tabernacle, this space for God to reside right there in the camp with them. So they build the tabernacle, and God's Spirit comes and lives with them. So at this point, though, they are still not, they're not holy enough to reside with a holy God. And so the book of Leviticus, the book of Leviticus, which comes after Exodus, is all about this idea of how to walk with a holy God, a way to a holy God, and how to walk with a holy God. So the book of Leviticus is basically all of these laws and all of the old rituals that were taught to them that they needed to obey to be holy enough to live with God. And so after that, when they start to implement these sacrifices and other things like that, Moses is actually able to enter into the tent and have communication with God at that point because of those rituals. They were able to actually live with and near God. They were holy enough through that. So I'm long-winded here, but so now we're through Exodus, and now it's time for the people to move on from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land. And so this is the book of Numbers, okay? So it's this idea of wandering from Mount Sinai all the way to the Promised Land. And while they are journeying, they lose heart. They grumble, they complain, they talk about the idea that it would have been better to be enslaved in Egypt. Halfway through from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land, they send 12 spies ahead into the Promised Land. And these 12 spies spend 40 days spying out this Promised Land. And they come back and they report to Moses and the people, and they say, there is no way that's the land for us. There's no way we're going to be able to conquer the giants that live in that land. It's too intimidating. That can't be right. And so, but two of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, they come back with a different story, and they say, we can conquer that land. With God, we can do it. They were trusting God. They knew they could do it. Well, unfortunately, the voice of the 10, and then they gather the masses, and they decide that they would rather go back to Egypt. They would rather go back to where they were enslaved. They didn't feel confident that they could do it. And so in that moment, God is angry again at his people for not trusting in him, that he would give them what he told them he would. And so he gives them what they asked for. And he tells them, okay, your consequence for not trusting me, 40 years in the wilderness. This generation will live 40 years in the wilderness, 1 year for every day that they spied out the land and came back and didn't trust. So for 40 years, the old generation, they live in this space just outside the Promised Land until they all die off. Even Moses, Moses has a moment where he angers God. God tells him to speak to a rock to bring water to his people, and Moses strikes the rock twice with his staff. His consequence, he's not allowed into the Promised Land. So all of this time of Moses leading them to the Promised Land, God tells him, Moses, I'm sorry, you're not going to be able to enter. So the old generation dies, the new generation is raised up, the 40 years have passed, and it's time to enter into the Promised Land. Moses has one last moment. The book of Deuteronomy is essentially a review. Moses gives 3 sermons to the people saying, hey guys, remember our past. Remember all that God has delivered us from and brought us to. He reminds them of the law, of what they had agreed to, the covenant they entered into with God. And he also tells them, hey, there will be consequences. Things won't go well for us if we don't obey those laws. So then Moses dies, and Joshua is raised up. Joshua and Caleb were the only 2 of the old generation to enter the Promised Land. Joshua was raised up to be their new leader. He is kind of like a Christ figure, like Moses. Like we were told that God was with Moses, we were told that God is with Joshua, and he's the one to lead them into the promised land. So now from Numbers, let's see, where am I at? The book of Joshua, okay? So this is when they are ready to enter into the promised land. So Joshua is leading them in. And they have this moment where the last thing they do is they need to cross the Jordan River to get into the promised land. And they step foot, they have the priest carrying the Ark of the Covenant, which is where God's presence is dwelling. And the priest step into the water, and God parts the Jordan River for them to walk across the Jordan River on dry land. And so now, boom, here we are. We're in the promised land finally. And Joshua is leading them. So now God says, Joshua, you need to... it's time for a conquest. You need to take this land. You need to conquer the inhabitants, the Canaanites that are living here. They are sinful people, and if I'm going to dwell, if my people are going to dwell in this promised holy land, we need to rid this land of those people. So their instructions were to essentially get rid of all of the Canaanites. So this is where we have the story. Joshua sends 2 spies ahead. They meet Rahab, who's not an Israelite woman. She's a Canaanite woman, but she has heard of the Israelite God. And she tells the spies that the Canaanites are fearful of God and fearful of the Israelites because they know that the God of Israel is powerful and is with them. So these spies make their way back and explain to Joshua, hey, we got this. The Canaanites are scared of us. We can do this. And so with confidence, they enter in to start taking over the land. We have the story of Jericho, where God explains to his people, trust me, do what I say, even if that means being passive. So he has them march around the walls of Jericho once a day for 6 days, and then 7 times on the 7th day. And they sound the trumpets, the walls come down, and God's people are easily able to take over, to conquer the city of Jericho. Because they were patient, because they listened to God, they were obedient. Then they get confident, then they get cocky. And they decide, oh, we're going to go ahead of God. And they enter into this next battle at a place called Ai. And they get destroyed. The Israelites are destroyed. And they, for a moment, and God tells them, I didn't tell you to go yet. Like, you need to listen to me. Basically, the book of Joshua in this conquering period is this idea that things will go well for them when they listen, even if it means being passive. It's God's battle to fight. He's going to do it. We see him send... hailstones down to kill the inhabitants of the land. He does several other stories, but God is always, things go well when they trust him, and things don't go well when they don't trust him. But eventually they conquer the land. But remember this point, they did not clear it out entirely of the inhabitants of the Canaanites. Some of the Canaanites were left in the land. But they conquered the land enough to where it was peaceful, and this is when Joshua spreads out the promised land. He gives a portion of the land to each of the 12 tribes of Israel. So the land has been conquered and settled. They lived there for a while. Things are well and peaceful. Joshua was a great leader, but eventually he dies off. And now they're left in this land of Canaan without a real leader. And that's when we enter into the book of Judges. So now there's this period of 300 years during the period of Judges, the book of Judges, where they don't have a leader. They don't have a king. There's no king yet. And everyone just does what is right in their own eyes. So the book of Judges is just this cyclical story of how the Israelites, how God's own people, this cycle looks like this. They are sinful, and they fall back into the ways of these Canaanites who are near them. They start to worship other gods, and they're sinful. God allows them to be taken into slavery, essentially, to be oppressed. And then they realize, oh my gosh, look at what we've done. And they repent, and they cry out to God, and he hears their cries. And so he sends them a form of salvation. He sends them a judge. People we've heard of like Gideon or Samson. They are these type of judges that come and they redeem the people of Israel for a moment. And there's this period of silence and things are good, but not very long before the cycle goes again. So 7 different times we see that cycle of sin, slavery, salvation. I'm I'm forgetting another word, crying out to the Lord, supplication, and then they go silent again. So Judges is just this cycle of the Israelite people worse and worse and worse. So by the end of it, the Israelites, it's depravity, utter depravity. We're a mess, and the Israelites are a mess. And this is where they cry out and start to say, "Hey, I think we need a king. I think we need a king like all these other nations around us." So in the book of 1 Samuel, we're introduced to Samuel, who God assigns as the last judge, the next leader of the Israelites. He does a great job for a while, but eventually things aren't going well, and the people get angry again, and they come to Samuel and they say, "We want a king." Samuel is a prophet. In his conversations with God, if you will, God says, "Okay, Samuel, give them what they want. It's time to give them a king." And so this is where Samuel anoints Saul as the first king of Israel. Now Saul is this tall, handsome, strong man. Looks the part. Like everybody thinks Saul is going to be this great first king of Israel. He's who they needed. He's their redemption plan. And quickly we find out that on the inside, Saul is prideful, arrogant, insecure, human. Just like us. So Saul does well for a while, and then he starts to become sinful, and Samuel goes back to Saul and says, "God has spoken. I'm here to let you know that I'm going to be raising up a new king, and that new king is David." So this is the part in the story where David is anointed as the next king of Israel, this young shepherd boy who goes on to defeat Goliath in the story we all know of David and Goliath, but this is the beginning of David. So it's the downfall of Saul and the rise of David at this time. Saul wants to kill David. He drives David out into the wilderness, chases after him, tries to kill him. David has opportunities to kill Saul, but he always passes. He says, no, I can't do this. God will exalt me to be the king when it's my time. I'm not going to take it in my own hands. So eventually Saul does die at the end of a battle. His son Jonathan dies, and David is anointed now the king of Israel. And he's off to a great start. The tribes love David. He's a great warrior. He's conquering the land around. They go back. He rallies the troops. They conquer Jerusalem. He brings the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, and he's doing great. He's having all these triumphs. And he says to God, David prays to God, he says, "God, let me build you a temple." He's like, we want this beautiful place for you to dwell. You've been living in a tent. He's like, "I want to build you a temple." God says, "No, David, you're not going to be the one to build a temple for me. You have too much blood on your hands, okay? But I am going to make this promise to you, David." And this is one of the high points, if not the high point of the Old Testament. It's called the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel 7. Where God makes this new promise to David, which is essentially an extension of the Abrahamic covenant, the land, seed, and the blessing. He says to David, "David, through your line, there will always be a king. Eventually there will be this eternal kingdom and this eternal king, but it will come from your line. You will always have the throne." And this is, like the high point for David. Eventually through that promise is how God is going to bless the people and bless the nations. So that's the high point, but David's human, and at that point, unfortunately for David, it starts to go downhill. He transgresses. He sees Bathsheba, this beautiful woman, and he wants her. She's married. He has her brought to him. He commits adultery. He commits murder to eventually cover up his adultery. And then the prophet Nathan comes to David and calls him out. And David knows he had done wrong, and David is repentant and seeks forgiveness and is granted forgiveness from God. But the consequences of David's sin in this point, he is going to have to feel those consequences. So this starts this turmoil, this downward spiral in David's life, where his own family becomes a mess. David eventually has a son who wants to overthrow him so that he can become the king. David is pushed out into the wilderness again. David eventually comes back to the throne when that son who wanted him killed was killed in battle. So now David comes back to his throne, but he's old, and to be honest, he's kind of washed up. He's not the leader that he used to be. And So now it's time for, thank you. My wife is good. Solomon, right? David has a son, Solomon, so he's going to pass the throne on to his son Solomon. And similarly, Solomon's off to a great start. Solomon asks God in a moment. He's given an opportunity to ask God for what he wants and what he needs. And Solomon asked for wisdom. And God thought that this was really humble of him to ask for wisdom, so he makes him wise. Not only that, he gives him riches, and he just gives him this opportunity to lead the nation. Well, Solomon, like all of us human, he eventually lets his pride take over in his sinful ways. And again, he starts to take hundreds of wives. Again, these Canaanite women and people who were still left in the land. And he strays from God. What was good for a moment, he was a good leader, and then he strays from God. So Solomon ends up passing the kingdom on to his son, I believe, Rehoboam. And at this point, Rehoboam takes over the nation, leading the nation of Israel, but he's doing it with an iron fist. And amongst the 12 tribes, 10 of these tribes are like, hey, we don't really agree with the way this guy's leading, so we're going to go form our own nation. So that's when we have this nation divided. And Israel, the nation of Israel, splits into two, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. So the southern kingdom is where the Davidic line remains. This is the nation of Judah, where it's the two tribes here. 10 tribes in the north, the nation of Israel. This is where we have the period of, this is the books of 1 Kings, 2 Kings. So in the books of 1 Kings, we see these stories of kings over and over of each nation trying to lead the Israelites, lead them back to God. But they all fail. None of them are righteous. As a matter of fact, it tells us in the story that in the north, 19 kings, 0 righteous. So the north is just on a downward spiral. In the south, 20 kings, 8 of whom are righteous. So they're doing a little better in the south. However, God is sending prophets. This is the period when God's prophets are sent, and they're trying to tell the people, turn back to God. You're you're growing away from God. This isn't going to go well for you. Here's what's going to happen. All these warnings, but it's too late. The nations are gone. They're too far gone. So God allows the nation of Assyria to conquer Israel, and these people are scattered across the earth. We never really hear much about the people that were scattered at that point. Judah lasts another 130 years because of these 8 righteous kings and some prophets that made some progress, but eventually they're too far gone as well, and God allows Babylon to conquer the southern nation of Judah. And this line of David is exiled into Babylon. So you're again wondering, like, okay, how is God going to fulfill this promise? How is God going to bless all of the nations? What's going to come next? We have this line of David in exile in Babylon. So I believe it's about 50 years later, God softens the heart of a Persian king named Cyrus, who decides Persia had conquered Babylon, and this King Cyrus basically decides that he's going to allow Zerubbabel to take some exiles back to Jerusalem. And this is the first wave of exiles back into Jerusalem. And Zerubbabel takes them, and he goes and he starts to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. When that temple is rebuilt in Jerusalem, this idea that God's presence would live in the temple is shattered, essentially, because the Israelites realize that the presence of God, the cloud of God, never comes back to this rebuilt temple. So we know something just isn't right. There are 2 other waves of exiles that return. We see Ezra bring back another wave of exiles, and Ezra really tries to rebuild the community and reinstate the law, and things go well for a short time. We have Nehemiah. You hear the story of Nehemiah brings exiles back, and they rebuild the wall around Jerusalem. So now Jerusalem is essentially rebuilt without the presence of God, though. And we have these Israelites who are back living in Jerusalem, and God is not with them. And this is that period of time where essentially God goes silent, if you will. No more prophets are trying to turn the people's eyes back to God or hearts back to God. The people of God are lost, and they're far from God. And this is that point in the story where we realize that the only thing that will really change the people of Israel is going to be a heart transformation, a complete heart transformation. And there is no king that will get them to that place, that will be able to redeem this story. We saw the story of God's people up and down. And was it going to be this man who was going to be their savior? No, it wasn't. Was it going to be this man? No. Was it going to be this man, this king, this prophet? None of that. There's only one man who can bring the nation of Israel back to God. And we are introduced to that man 400 years later, after 400 years of silence, the cries of a baby in a manger. Jesus is the one that comes to rescue us all. And that's the story that I learned of the Old Testament.